Hello, everybody, and welcome to Accessibility Talks, the monthly virtual meetup where we chat about digital accessibility, inclusivity, and usability. Each month, we invite a speaker to present a topic, and afterward, we invite the community to ask questions and participate in the discussion. I'm your host today. My name is Mark Casillas. I'm at Canopy Studios. I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where spring has sprung, which means every single piece of lint is in my face. So excuse me if I sneeze. My pronouns are he, her, and I am wearing an Alley Cats t-shirt, as you might be able to see here. Some other stuff that's going on. Well, I lost my notes like I always do. Before we get too far into the talk, I want to let you know we have live transcripts. They're available at streamtext.net /player, and then the event is A11yTalks. That's A11yTalks, TALKS. You can look for a link in the chat that should be showing up here really soon. And you can also enable the YouTube closed captions if that works better for you. So that's your thing. Want to take a moment to remind everybody that our groups seeks to provide a friendly and safe environment for all. We require all participants to adhere to the Accessibility Talks Code of Conduct, which is available on our website. This applies to all community interaction and events. It also applies to any questions as well as chat inside the text channels. It can be found at our website at A11yTalks.com. That's A11yTalks.com. And all participants should be able to engage in a productive dialogue and should share and learn with each other in an atmosphere of mutual respect, please. Want to give a shout out to our Alley Cat Club members. Thank you very much for your monthly financial contributions. That includes Carrie Fisher, Amy June Hyland, Rajab Natasha, Andrew Olson, April Sides, and Steve Woodsum. Thank you very much for helping us out with these accessibility talks. You want to see your name on that list and want us to say your wonderful name, you can go and learn more about our budget priorities and contributing and all that, and how you can join the Alley Cat Club as well. Alrighty. If you have any questions for our speaker today, please use the hashtag AlleyTalks. That's A11yTalks, TALKS, or type on the Twitters. That's what we're talking about there. Or you can type the chat window if you are participating in the YouTube live stream in the event. We're going to have our presentation here, and then we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A. You might be wondering what is our talk. What is the blank slide that I have right here? We actually have Hidde the Vries. I asked him to pronounce it so I wouldn't butcher it, and then I went ahead and did it anyway. Thank you very much for coming on in, and we're going to be talking about shifting left or making accessibility easier by doing it earlier. Thank you very much, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Marky. It is great to be here at A11yTalks. It's one of my favorite events. I'm joining today from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And yeah, I'm pleased to be here. I want to talk about making accessibility easier. And one of the reasons is that I have a lot of conversations with developer friends, and sometimes they ask me this question: why isn't accessibility easier? Now, this isn't a quote from a specific developer. It's a quote from many developers that I've talked to and that I know and befriended. And these aren't necessarily developers who don't want to do accessibility work or who feel like accessibility is a burden on them or anything like that. This is developers who actually are very accessibility minded. Otherwise, they wouldn't be my friends. And they want to get it right, but they find it hard. And I somewhat sympathize with that. It isn't super easy to do accessibility. And part of it is also the kind of surroundings or the context that accessibility work happens in. For instance, there are a lot of words that you need to know, like different things and know what they are. Like you need to know what way area is. and how it is used, techniques and understanding documents that come with the WCAG standard, but also the KOGA standard that's kind of, or the KOGA guidance that's added on top of the WCAG guidance, but isn't necessarily part of it and isn't a normative part. There is ACT rules that are interpretations of WCAG as testing rules. There's WCAG itself. There's different levels within that standard, A, AA, and AAA. There is also the ATEX standard for authoring tools and CMSs. There is testing tools like X. There is different guidance for low vision. There's assistive technologies and VR that you know about, as well as a document called XAUR, which goes into accessibility for VR and other types of immersive reality. There's different standards for browsers, UAG. Then there is a maturity model that is written at the W3C, but not as a formal standard. There is a standard for subtitles, closed captions. There is a working group that makes these guidelines. There's lots of laws, policies, semantics, evaluations, a specific language that you can express evaluations in, authoring practices, that aren't normative either. And then there's a standard for doing evaluations and statements that you can do based on them. Sorry, I've gone very, very quick. I am also sorry for who is capturing this, but basically, I have been reading out a lot of different words that you might want to know if you want to be good at accessibility, and that you need to know the context about. And I can understand that it's a lot for people to take in, especially if their job isn't to be an accessibility specialist, but their job is a web developer. You know, arguably, all web developers need to understand accessibility, but yeah, it's a whole world basically with a lot of phrases and a lot of abbreviations. Now, thinking about that question, why isn't accessibility easier? I've kind of distilled it to three separate problems that I think people have when they're trying to do accessibility. One is it's hard to know when something is accessible. Of course, there's the WCAG standard, which has success criteria, so you can try and make sure you meet those. But if you're building somewhat more complex things, so if your question isn't, you know, can I use this color on top of that color, like as a background and a foreground? If your question is more complex than that, and it's something like, oh, I'm building an autocomplete, and maybe people want to filter this stuff, so I want to have something that expands, and you know, you're trying to build an interface that is a bit more than just a document, and where a lot of stuff is going on. It can be quite hard to know when exactly you've reached that state of accessibility. We'll talk about that a bit more later. It's also hard sometimes for developers to find a time to refactor their code after audit results come in. That's something I hear a lot. And yeah, that's tricky. Like businesses make decisions on like which features are we going to ship, which bugs are we going to fix. But it is a problem that I've heard developers complain about. And then the last one is which documents and components can I actually trust? Is another really tricky thing to figure out if you're trying to build accessible websites, because there are a lot of things on the web that say they are like accessible components or that say that they are guidance, but they aren't necessarily very good. So people struggle with these three questions, and I think as an industry we can do better at making accessibility easier, and there are a lot of initiatives around that. I also think we need to, because it's the only way, I think, to actually get to more accessibility on the web. So that's why my presentation today is about shifting left and trying to make some of accessibility easier and figuring out how. Now, as Marky said, my name is Hidde. I am an accessibility specialist with a developer background. I previously worked at the W3C at the Web Accessibility Initiative, but also at Mozilla, the browser maker, and Sanity, a CMS maker. I have worked a lot with the Dutch government. I'm currently just joined a project there, the NL design system, which is a design system to be used across government. I like that sort of thing. I write about it on Hidde.blog. I do consultancy through a company called Hidde which is basically my name with .nl at the end. And yeah, web accessibility, I always like to frame it in terms of we need to make sure people with disabilities can use our app, our site, our service, that they can buy products. Sometimes I'll say that to clients who are in e-commerce. And the focus is on people with disabilities, not on making the web work for everyone, because it matters that you focus specifically on different disabilities. And um, sometimes I'll share numbers with customers and try to make uh, get the point across that it concerns a lot of different people, and probably a lot of people that and it might be one of them too. So accessibility is often framed in terms of what sort of disabilities do people have, but I think it's also helpful to think about it in terms of what sort of things do people do when they try and access a website. Because even if you are an organization that doesn't want to do accessibility, which some organizations surprisingly do, you still will get people on your website that are going to try and zoom in, or that are going to use high contrast modes, that are using a screen reader, that might not be using a mouse, or that use voice recognition, or that can't turn their device. These people will come to your website. So even if you decide, this isn't a priority for us, people will still come to your website. And if you're assuming they're not, you're not going to be accessible, but it's also just not a very smart business strategy. I like this as an accessibility strategy in general, just to assume less. I think it's something that as web developers and as people working on the web, we've kind of gotten really used to. Um, Here is a picture of a computer that looks a lot like the one I used when I first accessed the web. So it's a CRT screen, I think they're called, with an 800 by 600 resolution. It's got Windows 95, if I had to guess. And there's a CD-ROM player, a floppy drive, all that sort of stuff. That's what computers look like when we build websites then. But if we had assumed that all websites would be displayed in a context like that, we wouldn't be very successful at web development. And that was clearly pointed out to us when technology companies started making devices that were quite different, like the iPhone. It allowed you to look at the web on a tiny screen, and suddenly, we had to throw away the assumptions that we had. Making a website that works on 800 by 600, or maybe at the time we were at like 1000 by 800. That didn't fly anymore, because the devices wouldn't match that sort of expectation. So one thing that people like to say about accessibility organizations is that they claim we're 100% accessible. Now, I think it's important to point out that this is not a claim that you can make about your product. Nobody is ever 100% accessible. And the reverse is true too. No one is 100% inaccessible. It's likely that the website is at least going to be accessible to the person who made it, and then it's going to be accessible to a whole lot more people. But it depends on how well you've built it, basically. So accessibility is somewhere on a scale. It's not an absolute thing that you can claim about a product. And it has to do with a couple of different aspects. One is people. People use the web in many different ways, right? They might use a very old computer with a CRT screen. They might be using an iPhone. They might be using all sorts of different devices that you cannot control. But also that accessibility standards don't necessarily can take into account, because people have different disabilities, and not all of the disabilities are equally represented in accessibility standards. That's even something that WCAG says somewhere in the part that says layers of guidance. There's a sentence there. Even content that conforms at the highest level, AAA, will not be accessible to individuals with all types, degrees, or combinations of disability, particularly in the cognitive, language, and learning areas. So there are areas that aren't necessarily covered by these standards. And that would be, there's all sorts of things to say about that, but it would be really hard to cover all different disabilities. So people use the web in many ways. That's why something can never be 100% accessible or inaccessible. WCAG is also somewhat subjective in terms of how success criteria are interpreted. And again, this is not something that is easy to avoid, because if you want to have very objective criteria, you would need to have a lot of different criteria, right? You might need thousands of criteria if you wanted to make them very easy to say yes, accessible, no, not accessible. They need to be somewhat subjective if we want to have like roughly 50 criteria on AA, which is what we have in WCAG 2.1. So that's kind of by design, I guess. And then timing matters as well, because websites change all the time. You could have a website that is found to be accessible because you meet all the WCAG criteria, and then someone changes an image and it no longer is accessible. And yeah, that's another fact of life. So because of how people use the web, how criteria are somewhat subjective, and timing, you can never really claim that something is 100% accessible. But I also think that might be the wrong approach. I think it's important with accessibility to kind of work towards more accessibility, to have more of it, to figure out where you can improve and where you can make improvements. And that's something I think we should all be doing all the time. Um, Leonie Watson famously likes to say accessibility doesn't have to be perfect; it just has to be a little bit better than yesterday, and that's definitely a way that I like to think about accessibility too. So yeah, we don't really know for sure if our things are accessible. We just need to make sure we're always trying to make it better. Sometimes it can make sense though to pretend that we are sure. It's something that the Dutch government does when they collect accessibility statements from different government websites. So there is a website, dashboard.digitoegankelijk.nl. I'll share the URLs afterwards on a webpage so that you can easily access them. But basically, this dashboard gathers accessibility statements that are powered by WCAG audits, basically, of over 4,000 Dutch government websites. So over 4,000 websites, you can find out how well they meet WCAG and which criteria they meet or don't meet. And some of them have a so-called A status, which means they meet all of WCAG, or at least they did at a certain point in time. As we know, it depends on timing. And others, they don't. Now, this kind of dashboard, it makes sense to pretend that we have this kind of objectivity because it has a good knock-on effect. So managers within the government will see that, like, the people who live in the city of Amsterdam, which is the capital of the Netherlands, they might see that the city of Rotterdam, the city where I live, has better accessibility, and maybe they want to compete. So it can create this kind of system where people want to have better accessibility statements and better audit results. Again, it doesn't map directly to people's individual experiences and a more accessible web, but it does map there indirectly, and it does kind of push managers to make the right requests and maybe think about the right things when they're hiring people and when they're looking for different skill sets in developers. They might request accessibility knowledge rather than no accessibility knowledge. So it has that kind of knock-on effect. Sometimes it makes sense to pretend that we're sure. Now, I like to think about built-in accessibility a lot because I feel like if there are ways to make accessibility easier, we should kind of grab that chance. And it's not something that the world deserves, right? Developers don't deserve to have an easier life. I feel like it's more like we deserve a web that is accessible, and making it easier to do will kind of result in more accessibility. So yeah, it's not to make the developer's life easier, it is to make the lives easier of people with disabilities who want to do stuff on the web. Now, there are lots of ways where people try and make accessibility sort of more automated and built in. I'll start with the elephant in the room, I guess, overlays, which are companies that run a bit of JavaScript on a web page and then fix accessibility problems automatically. Yes, that would be great if it was possible, but as you can read on a website called overlayfactsheet.com, that isn't something that can actually be done, and there's a lot of ineffectiveness there. So that is actually not something I would recommend, and something I would recommend strongly against. So overlayfactsheet.com, if you're not familiar with it. Throw it at clients if they want to use overlays. So if we're looking at ways to build in accessibility, overlays aren't the one. There are other things, though, that can really be helpful when trying to build in accessibility. And one is design systems. As I mentioned, I recently started at a project at the Dutch government that tries to build a design system that is used across governments. A lot of teams are working on design systems. And what's really powerful about them is that we can make accessibility reusable and repeatable. And that is very helpful. Um, Design systems also have the power to make inaccessibility reusable and repeatable, right? So that's a word of warning. If you're building a design system and you don't make sure it's accessible, then you could also be spreading kind of fan type patterns there. But there's kind of different things that you can do in a design system. You can document stuff, right? Explain if you're using this component, maybe you should be using it in this way. So kind of trying to add some nuance to components. So it's not like, oh, you drop this in and it magically becomes accessible, but you explain the nuances of, oh, if you're using this, you should probably think about this or that. You can also make complex components available as code so that it is harder to use them inaccessibly. So think about things like tabs or, and I know those are controversial, but also like drawers and autocompletes. If there's somehow a way where you could invent that wheel once and invent it accessibly, that is very powerful. And then there are also automated tests that you can run against design systems. So there's lots of opportunity there. Another part where we could build in accessibility is into browsers. Um, I don't think browsers could magically fix everything, but I do think they could fix a small subset of accessibility issues in content automatically for you. Um, I've believed that for a while, and I did a talk about it. This is the awkward part where I put in my own talk in my own talk. I'm sorry for that, but let me indulge. I've put a couple of different ways that browsers can fix accessibility problems for users. One is to untruncate text. So if you have text that is truncated with CSS, and basically visually it looks like there's three dots at the end and the words are not finished. A browser could offer a setting where that just doesn't happen. That CSS just gets ignored because the user wants to read the text and not see the dots. Because it is all in CSS land, that would be something that is possible. Color contrast is another issue. I know we're working new color contrast issues, or we're trying to work them into new accessibility standards. But I feel this is really something that a browser could force upon websites. So if you have a bit of text that is on a photo and it is hard to read, then you could render a backplate behind that text. And that's actually something you could do today with Microsoft Edge if you turn on the right settings. So you would never have to see low contrast. You could just enjoy the contrast that you want to see. Focus indication is another one, and I know there are new criteria proposed there in WCAG 2.2. It's another case, I think, where if you want to see extremely clear focus, like a 20 pixel black border around everything that has focus, yeah, you could do that in a browser. You could force it over a website, and the designer of the website wouldn't be very happy if that happens, but the user probably would because you just want to see where you are. At least that's my relation to focus, right? I want to see where I am on the page, and something like that could be forced by a browser. And then lastly, autoplay of GIFs and videos. This is a barrier for many people, and we could wait for individual websites to try and have them all add like play buttons and pause buttons, or honor the media queries that exist for this, or we could just suppress autoplay of GIFs and videos technically. Another place where we could build in accessibility is into HTML. We could have more accessibility by default components. I've written a bit about that on my blog in a post called More Accessible Defaults, Please. Now, I won't go into it a whole lot more because I want to really talk to you about CMS accessibility. They are the last category that I wanted to mention today, and then I want to spend most time on. So in CMSs, you could also build in accessibility, and basically taking away the responsibility partly from developers and from content editors, and really trying to help both of those categories of people with getting accessibility right. Now, if we're talking about CMSs and their accessibility, there are two standards that come to mind. WCAG is the standard for web content, and then there's ATAG, which is the standard for authoring tools. So it stands for Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. It's for tools that make web content. And it is not as well known, and audits with ATAG aren't as common. They're also not as easy to perform because for WCAG EM, I mentioned that in one of the very first slides, real quick. There is an evaluation method that is somewhat official. It's not normative, but it's used by a lot of people that prescribes a process for testing your website, whether it meets WCAG. There is no such thing for ATAG, so it is a little bit harder to assess with ATAG, but it's definitely something that has a lot of criteria that can be very useful for CMS developers, and I'll get into a bit of detail in a bit. There's also a tool that I helped build when I was at the W3C. It is the ATAG report tool, and it allows you to report based on the ATAG criteria. So you can create an HTML file that gives you evaluation results and that you can look at. And there's also some work happening around a tool that will allow you to look at tools that meet ATAG. So that will take the results from the ATAG report tool, and it will let you kind of browse that and allow people who choose CMSs, like if you're working to buy CMSs or something, that you could do that. Now, I did a CMS review quite recently when I worked at a company called Sanity.io, which is a headless CMS. And I actually found it okay. I use the WCAG standard because I know that best and it has the process. But I did a bit of tweaking to make sure that kind of got results that would be reliable. And there are a couple of challenges with auditing a CMS like that. One is a CMS like the one I was looking at can be customized quite a lot, and which makes it really hard to make an accessibility statement about the CMS if everything you see is customizable and depends on what individual people do. So this isn't the case for all CMSs, but if your CMS is very customizable, that's tricky. Another thing is that it's a bit more tricky to define a scope and a target for the same reason. If you audit an individual website, you kind of know what the pages are, or you could find out by crawling the website or something like that. But for CMS, that's a bit harder, again, for customizability reasons. If it's customizable, you don't know what you can encounter at different installs of the CMS. Like everyone using the CMS might have customized it for their own needs. And then there's also a lot of usability issues that go way beyond WCAG, like real-time collaboration. There are a couple of things in WCAG that are about real-time, but there are a lot of things that you could do in a CMS, like work together with three people in the same bit of text, and your neighbor might be removing some words, and how do you get that across to different kinds of users is actually an unsolved problem, I would say, which I know there's a new task force or community group looking at this very issue at the W3C. So yeah, interesting to look at, I think. So yeah, there are two standards, WCAG and ATAG, that you can look at if you are interested in how accessible is my my CMS. And I think either have their value. And it's maybe good to know that within ATAG, WCAG conformance is part of the ATAG criteria. So the first criterion of ATAG is for the whole CMS to meet WCAG. So they are somewhat integrated. Now, there are two parts to ATAG. Part A of ATAG is about the editing experience, which means the part where people go in and change content. And then part B is about the output. So what sort of websites do you create with the CMS? I find that part the most interesting part in terms of how can we make accessibility easier and kind of move it left, shift it left. Because I like to summarize it as support the production of accessible content. That's what part B is about. So you're trying to help editors to make the right choices and to find out about problems early. So what is accessible content? Well, it is a lot of the things that we know from WCAG audits, right? We want our tables to have headers and form fields to have labels and hero images to have plenty of contrast, videos to have captions, multilingual content with the right lang attributes, nested according to specification, carousels that can be paused, sensible heading structures, all these sorts of things. And if you think about all these separately, then maybe you can imagine what sort of things could a CMS actually help with. Maybe a CMS can actually help avoid inaccessible content, avoid the issues in that. So avoid tables with no headers, nameless form fields, heroes with illegible text, videos that don't have captions, all these sorts of things. So maybe a CMS could actually help with that sort of thing. And some CMSs would have those kinds of features built in. Others can trivially add it. So there are a lot of CMSs these days where you can actually add your own plugins and make sure that the things that you want to see in the CMS are actually there. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples from the P part of ATAC where it is really about improving content from the CMS point of view. Now, one is 112, B112, which is when content is generated, it is accessible. So some CMSs will allow you to create tables, but then not properly nest them or not add the proper headings and stuff like that. So not all of the CMSs actually let you do all of the parts that you would expect in the resulting HTML. So that's something to look for in a CMS. Like if I'm going to create a table, is it going to be an accessible table? Another thing that a CMS could do is figure out, hey, there's a link there, but it's empty. That would be an accessibility issue. So that's something that a CMS could prevent before it goes live. Also, when content is generated, you could have a prompt for required information. Like when there's a table, it should ask you for a caption. When there's an image, it should ask you for alt text. Even if there is a carousel plugin where maybe a CMS will have a field for captions for alt text usually. But then when you have a carousel, they forgot to add it there too. I've seen that sort of thing quite often. Or maybe there's nothing that asks you for labels for your form field. So a CMS is really in the driving seat here because if it asks you for this stuff when you're an editor, it's basically going to help you to make that content accessibly versus not doing that. So if it doesn't ask you for that stuff, it's not going to be accessible. You could also imagine CMSs that have automated accessibility checks, which I think are cool. They don't solve all your problems, but they could find issues that you want to avoid. The CMS could also suggest manual checks, so help you with that. Like it could, before you press save, it could say, hey, do you want to look at your headings to make sure they are sense-making headings? Or if there are image alternatives that you managed in a central place, check if they apply in this specific use case, because an alternative text needs to make sense in the context of the page that is used in. Another thing that CMSs could be really powerful at is if they have a template system where, maybe there's a gallery where people could download templates, that those templates are accessible. So if you're a CMS maker, you could make sure that at least your demo stuff is all super accessible so that when people start taking that as an input, you can kind of propagate that accessibility. And the opposite is true too. If your standard default templates are not accessible, then that inaccessibility is going to propagate. So there's a lot of impact that a CMS can have there. Then there is also a bit about what the spec calls pre-authored content, and I've kind of taken that as UI components. Basically, if you provide UI components, make sure that they are accessible. Color contrast, I think, is an interesting one. What if your CMS could look at your text and a background image and tell you when something is wrong? So here I have a picture of a cat that sits in front of my bookcase, and there is a heading in front of that in white text. It has perfect contrast, but when my editor changes the picture to, say, a picture of Korean food in this case, maybe that picture is too light and it no longer has sufficient contrast. A CMS could perfectly find out about that, and it could give you a warning and say, hey, you don't have enough contrast. It could even give you options like, hey, do you want to add a background color, or do you want to make the text larger or bolder font? I mean, we have tools that can generate novels in the style of Shakespeare these days, so it should be possible to generate accessible combinations of colors for sure, because it doesn't need any intelligence, right? Um, then spell checkers could be another feature that SMS could build in, and if they are in the browser, they could even leverage the browser spell checking. Again, that could be helpful because maybe you didn't see that your button's name is SWB because the font makes it look like that just says submit, but then when you hear it in a screen reader, it suddenly doesn't make much sense. So spell checkers can be helpful. Readability checkers, um, another example. So with all of that, I feel like CMSs could really be accessibility assistants, and I think that would be really really cool. I'm not saying we should bring Clippy back like we used to have in Microsoft Word, what kind of that, but in your CMS and specifically about accessibility issues and maybe about other things too, right? Maybe there are security issues or SEO issues, maybe. But I think accessibility issues matter a lot because they are about actual people rather than search engines. So that's something that I feel would be really cool if CMSs would be a bit more proactive at figuring out what sort of problems you have so that they can warn you before you put a website live that has these issues. And there are actually CMSs that already do that. Like Joomla has something called QAlley that you can run on your text area. It feels sometimes a bit like one of those accessibility overlays, but now you're not bothering the end user with it, but you're bothering the editor with it. They can now use this as a tool to figure out that they have problematic stuff, like maybe they have link text that don't make sense, or they have stuff with insufficient contrast, or their forms without labels. This is the sort of thing that a tool can find out about, can tell you before you press publish. And I think that's very powerful. Then you're shifting it left. So you're not publishing an inaccessible bit of content, but you're preventing it at the point of the CMS. In Drupal, there is editorially, which is based on Sally. It's a very similar tool to the one in Joomla, and even in WordPress Gutenberg, which had some accessibility history that I won't go into. But even there's stuff like suggestions around color contrast, where if you change the text color to a different color and it doesn't have enough contrast with the background, a warning will show. So what I'm showing here in the screenshot, the warning says this color combination may be hard for people to read. Try using a brighter background color and or a darker text color. So that's helpful. It could even have a button that gives you a color and automatically applies it, like be lucky kind of button that you used to have in Google. It could figure out like, oh, this background is dark yellow, so I'm going to need black or something like that, and allow you to do that with one click. I feel like we could really make it easier for people to get it right. Now, I think there's specific opportunities for CMSs that don't store HTML in the database, but have like a structured format. Um, because, and here is just an example of the format that is used in Sanity, the CMS I used to work for, and that I'm familiar with. So it basically has everything exist as JSON. And the advantage of that is that you can basically go through all of your content and write a script that is going to check for potential issues. So because there's no HTML, it's a lot easier to kind of traverse. So you could find out things that you want to know about, like validation. So maybe you want to know, like I've done here, there is a heading or a bit of bold text, I should say, that doesn't have end in the period, so it's probably a heading, or there is something that looks like a list, but it's basically two paragraphs that start with a dash, and there's a link that is called click here. Now these are all things that you could find out if you have the content available as a script. And on this URL, github.com/hidde/port alley, Again, I'll be sharing the links afterwards. You can find a bunch of JavaScript functions that you can apply specifically to Sanity, but probably can also be applied to other CMSs, where you can go into the structure of your content and then figure out about problems and maybe give warnings. Now, this is specifically written for the Sanity format, but the same kind of principle could very much be applied to other CMSs and give people warnings and be creative about it. Because, yeah, you want to have semantic markup, you can find unsemantic things. Not all of it, but you can find some of it. Like links that are called click here is a good example of that. That's something you could warn users about to prevent that sort of inaccessibility from happening. And there might be other things like, do your headings have hierarchy? Are the links empty maybe? Or do they have an image that doesn't have an alternative, which means it doesn't have an accessible name? All these sorts of things could be invalidations and, be dealt with at the content editing level. Now, one last thing that I think CMSs could be powerful at is by providing previews. CMSs like WordPress and others, they allow you to preview your content. And if that kind of thing is customizable, you can make previews that are specific for accessibility. So you could make a preview of the heading list that a lot of screen readers have. So screen reader users browse by heading. So you could just display all the headings as a preview and then ask the editor, does this make sense? Is this a good strategy or not? And if you do that on like a Wikipedia page, it's probably good because it's written for to be usable content. But if you do it on a random marketing page, you might find headings that don't actually offer a lot of help. Or you could make previews that display the page in certain color modes and things like that. So I feel like for previews, there's another layer of like, here we can help users detect issues themselves by showing them, oh, this is what all your links look like out of context. Do they make sense? And if it displays just a list of click here's, then people will find out that there's work to do. Now, I think this could be helpful for users who don't have a lot of accessibility experience if it gives the right guidance, but also for users who do have a lot of experience but just didn't pay attention because they were too focused on the content, just as like a final check. So yeah, I didn't really solve the problem of why isn't accessibility easier within this talk, but I do feel like there are a couple of things that can make accessibility easier. One is to have more built-in things and kind of focus as a community on what sort of things can we build in to browsers, to standards, to design systems, to CMSs, so that it becomes easier to repeat what goes well and harder to repeat what doesn't go well. With that, it's good to remember that we're never done, right? Accessibility isn't an absolute state that you can get into. We just need to do a couple of months' work, then we're 100% accessible, and then we no longer need to look at it. It's a continuous thing, and that is not depressing. That is just part of life. Like everything on your website is continuous, so it's your accessibility. And then lastly, CMSs that can warn early and give you previews that allow you to do manual reviewing, I think can be a very powerful combination in making sure that they really help to get it right, basically. And with that, I want to thank you very much. The slides for this will be available on urltalks.hiddetevries.nl, and I'll be sharing it in the chat as well, so that you have easy access to the URLs there. Thanks so much for watching.
Alrighty, we do have quite a few questions that have popped up in the chat and then through the discussion. First one, Amy June asked, you say assume less. What are some common assumptions besides just monitors for accessibility?
Yeah, there are a lot. So monitors is kind of an example outside of accessibility, I guess. Like it's one that anyone who's worked on the web has kind of had to deal with. Like suddenly the web existed on more places. We could no longer assume that we knew how big a website would be. And I remember the times where like designers would have different screen sizes and ask the developer to build that. But at some point, they stopped doing that because there were too many screens. So that happened. But in terms of accessibility, there's a lot of assumptions, right? There's people like one example is if you have an online pizza service where you can order pizza, and the only way to contact is to have a phone call. So when the driver arrives at your house, they will call you. Then the assumption is that the person taking the pizza can hear a phone. Maybe they are hard of hearing or they're deaf. Then they wouldn't be able to interact with you. That's an assumption, like that people can hear or that people can see or that people can, there's all sorts of assumptions made. As I'm sure we're all very familiar with in the field of accessibility, but that's yeah, lots of assumptions. And yeah, if we can try not to assume, I think that's a powerful strategy, especially for people who don't know a lot about accessibility. They can at least know about not assuming, I guess.
Cool. Alrighty. Next question is you say website can't be 100% perfect. Then what percentage should we be shooting for? Is there a
I love that
number?
question. I think you should be shooting for 100%. But just realize like it's not going to be done. Maybe you should assume even reach for a 200%, right? So, like do better than everyone else for sure. Um, the point really being like, yeah, we don't know for sure. Like you are always going to have users who cannot access it, and I guess as a person running a website, you need to find out about that and try and fix it. That's why accessibility statements have contact options and things like that, and why we should all be doing user tests, right? We need to find out where the barriers are that we don't know yet, but they will be there for sure.
Yeah, I always say just find out what you're doing wrong and then fix it, and then find out the next thing. So
Yeah. There's always going to be a next thing. And I don't mean that to be depressing. That's just a thing. Yeah.
it's called
It
job
happens.
security. So
Yeah.
so Kat asks, I always thought that browsers should make the data tables responsive and accessible by default. What do you think of this idea?
Yes. Yes. That would be fantastic. It's one of those components that I guess every single design system is trying to figure out for themselves how to do that and then come up with solutions, sometimes really good solutions. But yeah, it feels like a browser knows what a table is and it can expose it in lots of different ways. Like it exposes it to a screen reader, it goes to the table mode and everything. Or screen readers can access it. So a browser should also be able to make it visually responsive in a way that makes sense. I do think it's a really hard problem to solve because people have opinions about what it needs to look like. So someone who designs a website wants to know what they're designing or what it's going to look like. So it's a lot of concerns to manage. I think, and we're just trying this with like a select menu to try and make a select that kind of works, and it's just really hard like to give the browser control over what stuff looks like and have everyone be happy. But yeah, I think they should try because it would make life easier, I think.
Cool. Always the question: how often should people be testing their digital products?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of layers to that, right? I think it makes sense to continuously test with like automated tests and just make sure you kind of keep testing what you can do to your own ability. So, like when you're a developer, do that. But there should also be on the kind of other end of the spectrum, like regular audits. Have a company look at it specifically that is external and that can use the right methodologies. And then there's a lot of stuff in between too. So any opportunity of testing that you can kind of move into your process, I think makes a lot of sense. Like if you're doing Scrum and you have a Scrum meeting thing where the stakeholders are there, do a demo without a mouse and then see how it goes. Like that sort of things, I think, yeah, can also help to find out problems. Everyone should be testing and as often as possible, and there should be formal tests as well. I mean, this is just me speaking out of unlimited budgets and things, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the driver right there as well. Yeah. What are some of your favorite LA testing tools?
So I use some of the automated tools, but I don't have a strong preference because they only kind of find a certain amount of issues, and I'm happy that they find for me. But I guess my favorite testing tool is sort of my own WCAG knowledge, which is a bad thing to say because that's not very transferable. But I guess that's where I get most value out for, say, like my clients is things that I've seen before or that I notice or yeah, that I look for basically.
Yeah, I mean there are so many out there that you don't want to just default to one and then check a box. You want to be able to round out a lot of things in my mind anyway. So
Yeah.
alrighty, can you talk more on WCAG 2.2 and 3.0? Do you have any thoughts on it?
Sure. So 2.2 is coming soon. It has been coming for a while, but I think it's fair to say it's coming soon. WCAG 3 is far away, and by that I mean very far. So I would say at least 5 years. It might be more, and it might also never come. That's my blunt view on kind of what will happen to that. So yeah, WCAG 3 is just very, very unsure what exactly is going to happen. But 2.2 is easier to say. I expect that to be released this year.
Excellent. Let's see. Seeing if there are any more in the chat there. I think that's going to be it for the questions. Thank you very much for your time today. A lot of great information in there. Very interested in that the CMS stuff that you talked about. Just a reminder to everybody, we're always looking for speakers and new voices in the accessibility community. If you have the IAAP certification, A11yTalks speakers and attendees can receive professional development credits for your continuing education. Want to let you know we do make a conscious effort to include marginalized groups in tech in our speaker lineup. So let us know if you have more ideas on how to make A11yTalks more friendly to all, and if you want to come talk with us. To subscribe, of course, you're all on the YouTube channel now. You can subscribe to us at youtube.com/accessibilitytalks. So you'll never miss a talk. Consider contributing to A11yTalks. So we've talked about the Alley Cats through our Open Collective page at opencollective.com/A11yTalks. Follow us on the Twitters or on the Mastodons, depending on where you like to do your following and whatnot. And like we said before, if you want to subscribe, you can enjoy a lot of benefits and join the Alley Cat Club to help achieve our mission through to normalize digital accessibility through education. Considering either giving a one-time donation or a monthly donation, you can go to alleytalks.com/pages/sponsorship to learn much, much more. And that's the last slide right there. So thank you very much for joining us. Next month, we're finalizing what's going on next month on our talk. We're hoping to announce that real soon. So we'll see you out there on the inner tubes. Thank you very much.